Hello everyone and welcome to this debate on the EV revolution and how the power sector and mobility is coupled together. It's amazing to see that and of course good morning, good evening, good afternoon to wherever you are, because it's so great to see that all of us are here together but at the same time following social distancing and working from home. So something which is difficult has brought us all together. We have a very interesting panel here today to talk to you about this topic. Let me introduce to you quickly Dr. Emilia Sumolainen. She works for Vedicom Institute. They do very interesting work, especially on sandboxing of V2X technologies and similar charging technologies. Then we have Professor Pablo Frias. He is the Vice Dean of ICAI at the University of Comillas in Madrid. He is also in charge of the Spanish EV Observatory, and indeed we have a very close working relationship where he helped us while we were working on the Charging Up India's Electric Mobility report last year. And finally we have Mirko Armiento, again Dr. Mirko Armiento from the NL Foundation. He is an expert with mobility as well as the power sector, and they recently came up with a report on urban mobility and its impact on the grid and on resilience, etc. So we indeed live in very interesting times. I know that black swan events like the COVID take us to a point where we cannot consider projections, but here there is a projection of the EVI of the International Energy Agency, which shows that the EV revolution is here and we will see more and more of an electric future in mobility. This can also be seen by numbers. A very small example of that would be the Tesla Cybertruck, which already has a registration of 500,000 to 550,000 according to media reports, and this is up to 30 billion in revenue for Tesla. And this vehicle is just one pickup truck category. There have been key drivers for EVs, and this is reduction in crude imports for some countries, air pollution and improved public health. We already see that with all the cars off the road, we're already breathing much better air. So EVs maybe can help us do that for a long time. Emission goals, interestingly, I think in 2020, all countries will reach their CO2 emission goals, at least for this year. We don't know about the future. But, and then finally, there are industrial ambitions of manufacturing these electric vehicles in different countries. But one thing that we always have to keep in mind is that electric mobility is a beautiful example of sector coupling, where the charging infrastructure and the charging station itself acts like a barrier and a frontier between the power sector and energy-rich load which connects to the power grid, which can be flexible in time as well as in location. So now we have a quick question, because this is where we are going to discuss today about this coupling of the power sector and mobility and what sort of impacts that we see. So before we go into that debate, we would like you to take a quick quiz, a poll which is from the power sector perspective. We want you to choose one of the following three options of what you think is the key barrier for integrating electric mobility into the power sector. Jess, can you run the poll now, please? Okay, indeed, very interesting results here. Pablo, I think you have your hands full because half the people think it's policy and regulation, which seems to be the key barrier, followed by business models. And then we have technology, but it seems quite a big mix, although we have a clear winner. So, Jess, can you please put the presentation on again? So this really takes us to our first topic of discussion for today's debate. The structure is as followed. Each of our presenters will have 4 minutes to make an opening comment, and then there will be some time for them to react to each other, after which we will move into the next question. So what is our first question? So we just saw that we have this really nice sector coupling that has happened, and we have this very interesting load which is into the system. There are a lot of challenges as well as opportunities that have come up because of EVs, as we see, especially from the EVs, the rapid growth of EVs in the power sector. We can truly divide these into 3 perspectives like we put in the quiz about the technology, policy and network industry perspective. So why don't I go first and we follow the order in which we got the results of the poll, and I give the floor to Pablo and to ask him what is your opinion, Pablo, about policy regulation from your experience of both sides of the coin, of EVs as well as of the power sector.
Okay, so thank you, Prad, and good afternoon all. So I think that in order to tackle the problem of regulation, of the power system regulation and the EV integration regulation, we need to go one step behind, which is to try to understand how real regulation or real government is being done. Sometimes technology moves far from regulation, and other times is regulation usually behind the technology. But anyway, regulation is the main driver that we can have for sustainable mobility. When I talk about regulation, I always think in my mind like an engineer in 2 axes. So I always think about the vertical axis, which is top-down approach, and then some horizontal level. And that's the thing that I want to explain in these 4 minutes. So for me, vertical and top-down approach, which is something that Prad mentioned in his slide, is basically coming from very top level, very high level analysis that can be done through the United Nations, like the Paris Agreement. We can have in Europe a specific regulation, or in the States specific regulations. Then we go down into a national level, and finally we end into the local level. The thing is that each of the different levels, they currently have its different objectives. In the very top level, they are thinking about the environmental concern, greenhouse emissions, climate change. If we go down to the national level, countries are really cared about energy dependency. But if we go down really to the municipalities, which are nowadays taking the hands of regulation, they are focusedly on traffic congestion and, most important, air quality. So the thing is that right now, the objectives of all the decision makers in the line are not fully aligned. So that's one of the questions why we need, let's say, to push about some coherency in the way policymakers are doing. The second thing, which I believe is also really important, is the horizontal level. So for instance, if we go into at national level, into the government, we can see that the electric mobility or sustainable mobility impacts different ministries. It impacts the Ministry of Environmental, the Ministry of Tax Collection, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Industry. So there are like many elements, decision making at the same level that, of course, the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Environmental, they want clean and low pollutant transport. However, the Ministry of Economic or Financial and the Ministry of Industry will always question if these measures are really sustainable from a system point of view. So again, we need, let's say, some coordination at this horizontal level, and also coordination at vertical level. Nowadays, what happens is that the local municipalities are the ones that are taking the lead. So we can think about Stockholm, we can think about London, we can think about Paris, Madrid, or any other, let's say, city that is facing real problems, okay? So nowadays, they are the ones that are sparking somehow the electromobility. But of course, this is a challenge because the rest of the people need to coordinate. Because if now we want to jump into the power system sector, we need to also have some coordination with the national government, and of course with the EU policy, and of course with some others. Okay, so with this I finish my answer to the first question, Prat. Thank you.
Thank you, Pablo. Indeed, it's interesting, and a point which is the coordination between these vertical and horizontal levels, and the amount of inertia that exists when you talk about policies and policymakers and the number of different policymakers that are involved and regulators that are involved. But Mirko, moving to you now, you come from NL. You are the ones who are really also affected by the way these policies and regulations are made. At the same time, you provide a lot of work with mobility itself, because mobility is something that will eventually be connected to your grids. Please tell us more about what is the perspective of the network industry on this and the business.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Well, first of all, as you mentioned also in the question before, I would say that investments in resilience and business continuity are vital. I mean, especially in the power sector. So should never be postponed, as also was demonstrated by the increasing number of global crises, and as the one we are facing right now, but especially about the crisis that will come in the future, especially talking about the climate disasters. As was demonstrated that the number of extreme events just really increased a lot in the last decade. And I would say that apart from that, in order to tackle climate change, it's important so to also deploy more and to have more electric vehicles. And this can really be coupled together also from an industrial perspective very well with the power sector. Anyway, with the electric vehicles deployment, we will have a lot of benefits. As you mentioned before in the first slide, we will have environmental benefits, of course, in terms of less CO2 emission that will be released in the atmosphere. In particular, we know that the transport sector is responsible for over a fourth, so 25% of all CO2 emissions. So if we are able to, reduce a lot the emission in this sector, we will really help to tackle climate change. But at the same time, regarding environmental, should also be remembered that noise pollution is a big problem, because our roads are really noisy, and then especially because all the traffic and so on, and the vehicles are really noisy. So if we have more electric vehicles, we really reduce a lot also the noise pollution. But at the same time, what's even more important is the other things you mentioned in the first slide, and it's the improvement of air quality. So we will have a lot of air quality benefits. As we know, more or less almost 7 million people die every year just for air pollution, and this is a huge figure. So if we are able to reduce particulate matters and nitrogen oxides, so we are reducing the emission of this pollutant in the air, we can really improve our quality of life in general. And let me just say also something that is really, it seems also that also this virus is correlated with air pollution. So the most polluted area, I'm talking from Rome in Italy, and we are really much affected about this virus. But in the north, in the Pianura Padana region, it's one of the most polluted area in Europe, and there is where also the virus spread more easily. And there are also other evidences that many papers are being published recently that are trying to show this correlation that the virus is easily is affecting more the polluted region. So it's another reason more to try to push for electric vehicles in order to reduce that. Apart from that, I would also mention that there will also be, apart from technical and economic benefit that probably Emilia will talk about, there are also some social benefits with electric vehicles, because we can create new jobs, because there will be new industry that need to be created, so we can have a lot of opportunities. Apart from that, if we are able with electric vehicles, with new technology as well, to encourage the modal shift and bring people to use more, for instance, public transportation, we will be able also to reduce the traffic congestions, and we will have a lot of positive externality, let's say. So we should really, be pushing for this revolution, as you mentioned, especially because it can be coupled very easily with the power sector.
Thank you, Mirko. Indeed, there is a lot we can do with the power sector in terms of the resilience, in terms of other issues, and we can also think about how this power-dense load is going to affect the grid itself in terms of the peaks changing, in terms of the flows in the grid changing at operational and investment level. Is something we'll take up as we go on in this debate. But before that, Emilia, no, I think this whole story doesn't end without really talking about the technology and the techno-economic angle, which is so important for, you might have the best policies and the best intentions and the best network industries and everybody wanting EVs, but if you really don't have these technologies, we cannot unlock the full potential for the power sector. So tell us more about these really interesting things that you do at Vedecom, as well as your opinions and thoughts about how technology can take us forward.
Okay, so thank you, Pad, and good afternoon to everyone here from Paris. So I wanted to start by talking about the opportunities that you underlined. So as has been stated by many, EVs are basically batteries on wheels, which means that they could be used to provide these various flexibility and storage services. So either locally at the home, building or community level, or to the TSO or the DSO. So, and as you all know, cars are in the vast majority of cases very underused resource. So they stay parked for well over 90% of their time. And also, when you look at the daily mobility needs of people, they're usually very small compared to the total amount of energy that can be stored in EV batteries. So what this means is that EVs are basically a free resource in the sense that they are going to be there in the mobility system in the future. So why not to exploit them also for the power system? And also, there are some very interesting synergies that can be found between the deployment of EVs and intermittent renewable resources. And EVs could also facilitate the deployment of these renewable resources. So together with Professor Yannick Perez from Central Supélec, we notably have a PhD student, Icaro Freitas, who's doing very interesting work on this coupling between EVs, renewables, and also stationary storage. So he has recently published a review paper in the Journal of Renewable and Sustainable Energy Reviews that I invite you to have a look at it if you're interested in that. Of course, one of the issues that we face when integrating these EVs into the power system is the fluctuating availability of these EVs, and also sometimes the unpredictable need for grid services. So in this context, we're also working with EPFL and Dirk Lauinger to see how to better take into account these uncertainties in the system to provide reliable ancillary services. And we should have a paper coming out with Dirk soon as well, if you're interested. But in addition to this, of course, you still have many other technical challenges in bidirectional charging that Vedicom is also working on. So you notably have things like how much will this V2G equipment cost? Should the charger be in the vehicle or rather on the infrastructure side? You also have lots of people working on the improvement of the chargers and of their components. You also need to define how to control the charging, what kind of charging algorithm should be used. Another very important issue is to limit battery degradation. You have different standardization issues, communication protocols that need to be defined. And also one other very important point is that we need to ensure the consent and willingness of the EV drivers to participate in these energy services. And of course, this means that we also need to have cybersecurity. We need to protect the private data of the users. And also we need to define who has the right to access all this charging data and to exploit it. So just to conclude and come back to the poll results, so I quite agree that it would seem that most of the challenges are on the policy and regulatory side, which has not kept up with the technological development. And this is also something that comes up in the review paper that I mentioned earlier. Thank you.
Thank you, Amelia. Indeed, like I said already, the technology is going to be one of the main driving forces, especially when we come to the question of vehicle to grid. For me, interestingly, one point that came up and which is also very important is the fact that we have challenges to the distribution system, which many countries and many people are concerned with from EVs, because EVs can be really complex in terms of the fact that they can be charged at any time during the day as well as at any location. So I would like some reaction from the panelists on what do you think are the challenges for the system, and how can we use things like dynamic tariffs, time of use, or other methods to work on these challenges?
Yeah, sure.
Pablo, maybe you can take this question.
Just a couple of ideas before we get into the question. So the first thing is that nowadays, for instance, at least in Spain and in other countries, when people are facing the challenge of integrating electric vehicles as an additional load, we may think that this is the only load that will happen in the coming years, and that's not correct, because we will have, at least in some countries or regions, we will have the heat pumps, and these for sure will be an additional effort, and usually this effort will be in the peak times. So that's one of the things. Okay. The second thing is that it really depends on the network you already have. So in most European countries, what we have is we developed the distribution network very far in the, 50 years ago. Nowadays, in some regions, they are at the end of their life, so they are really congested. So in specific areas, we are facing some challenges in integrating not only electric vehicles, but other types of new loads. But we always need to have in our minds that we are also moving into the energy efficiency. So it is expected that somehow there is a slow reduction in the consumption, and that's the type of thing. So it is not a yes or no. but it is electric vehicles will be, let's say, another ingredient for the distribution system operators to really think about.
Mirko, would you like to weigh in? And also we had one question about the noise, that the noise issue is more from the tires than from the car itself. So maybe a point on that.
Yeah, okay.
And also I had a question about the third one, which is interesting from a mobility perspective, is what about countries which are blessed with oil and natural gas? And how do you expect them to move to electric?
Okay. Then let me just go quickly through the noise thing. Okay, yeah, it's true, the tire is also noisy, but I mean, if you're talking about developing countries, especially you're from India and you know better than me, it's not just the tires that are noisy. I mean, it depends, of course. The newest cars are not so noisy, but in any case are noisy. Electric vehicles, I mean, you can barely hear when they are passing, so it's also dangerous because they are not noisy. But in any case, the damage of this pollution was calculated that there are something like over 90 million people just that are affected by this in the huge city, in the megalopolis, just in Europe. So for this, I mean, we should be concerned. But I would just also add another idea of what Pablo was saying before regarding the coupling and how electric vehicles can play a major role also in the future system, in the future electric system. I mean, if we are thinking, for instance, in electrifying public transportation, this can be a solution because, as we know, public transport, they have a fixed schedule, so they have demand patterns that are really very predictable. And usually they run during the day. They can work as a large battery on wheels, no? So they can actually be charged during the night when there is no peak. So they can help a lot in balancing the system, because they can inject, they can absorb energy during the night and use it during the day. So this can be a really great help and should be, probably I can also go and talk about more later about our paper at Tenor Foundation, for instance, illustrating the case in Santiago del Chile about electric buses. But in any case, this can be a great, opportunity, although it's a challenge, of course, because it's difficult to be, to harmonize all these factors, especially in a system that are that still are lacking some policies and some regulations. Finally, regarding your last question about, you asked me regarding the oil, the fact that many countries, for instance, Italy again, but many others that are they have to import these fossil fuels. In this way, with electric vehicles, especially if first of all we will have, we will save some money, and because electricity can be produced, as we are seeing more and more increasingly, by renewable energy sources that are kind of free, apart from the investment cost, but at least the fuel is free. And so, if we are going and looking forward in the next decades, I would say that with energy that is produced from renewables and electric vehicles, we can really also reduce the dependency from fossil fuels, apart from what we were talking about before, reducing the impact, the environmental effects.
Indeed, and also a very interesting point that Nicolo Rossetto made in the quick Q&A box is that these fuels of gas and oil, they also represent a huge income for the governments itself. So this income really needs to be replaced at some point with something else once you have electric vehicles, and where do you load this onto? But moving on to Emilia, in terms of technology, we have still this question which especially comes up when you're, like, we have countries at different levels of development, right? And a question that really comes up all the time is about range anxiety with electric vehicles. This is something Europe has really been looking into, and we have these huge number of charging stations coming up. But what are your perspectives on range anxiety? And you can also touch upon these other questions that we already...
Okay, thanks, Pam. So it's true that range anxiety is really the principal preoccupation of car manufacturers, but also of people who consider buying an EV. However, it has been shown in multiple studies that usually for the everyday trips, EV batteries are quite sufficient. So the problem occurs more for the long distance trips, which means that we would either need to implement fast charging stations everywhere along the highways, or otherwise we would need to find some kind of other alternative solutions for the long distance trips. So at Vedicom, we're notably working with a startup called EP Tender that's developing this external range extender for long distance trips. And this range extender could also be used to provide vehicle-to-grid services when not used for mobility purposes. So
I think we lost Amelia on this call.
I see she's back.
Sorry, lost connection.
Hello?
So just to finish my remark, so another thing that's often proposed, of course, to gather for to be able to do long distance trips with EVs is that we should separate the uses. Actually, use a different vehicle for our everyday trips, and another vehicle for long distance. So maybe not an EV, but a different technology.
Indeed, I think I agree completely with this idea that we will eventually go on to some sort of a hybrid before going fully EV, when you have one vehicle for long distance and one for city. And I see there are lots and lots of questions here, but let's come back to the questions afterwards, and let's go to the second very interesting point, which Carlos right now put in a question in the Q&A about vehicle to grid. So V2X, as it's called, vehicle to everything. So Jess, can you put our first, our next poll online, please? So what do you think is the most valuable service that these vehicle to
Just a few more seconds. Let's get everyone's votes in so we can tie them into the discussion.
So indeed, the first and most important point would be that vehicle to grid services to provide frequency response voltage control seems to be the runaway winner, followed by a more self-consumption approach of V2H, housing, buildings, commercial loads, I mean, etc. But in this question, Jess, can we have the presentation, please? Vehicle to X can work in many ways, and it's innovation being one of the most crucial elements of how vehicle to X would perform in the future, and how we can unlock the huge opportunity that vehicle to X provides. But for this question, I would really like to go first to Emilia, who works with this all the time, and ask her more about the technology innovations that go behind vehicle to X and what's happening. I see France is also at the forefront of this V2X innovation. So we would really like to know more about how.
Okay, so thanks, Brad. I think you're right that, of course, these innovations and new technologies, they're the key to exploiting this coupling between EVs and the power system. And as you may know, there are many experimentations around the globe on V2G. I think there are over 50 projects, and also a few startups already, but no large-scale deployment yet. One question that I often get here with respect to V2X or V2G is whether it is truly interesting to do V2G and bidirectional charging. People sometimes suggest that it would be enough or more interesting to do just smart charging or one-directional charging. Of course, the experimentations have shown that both are technically feasible. However, there are some studies that would seem to suggest that the smart charging would be sufficient for many of these energy services. But on the other hand, it would seem that this current preference for smart charging solutions reflects the current regulatory constraints and the current market. So with different regulations, it might be much more interesting to implement this bidirectional charging and V2G. And this has notably been shown by researchers from DTU that V2G could potentially provide much more value than just one-directional smart charging. And also our work with Dirk Lauwinger at EPFL should confirm these findings. Another thing I wanted to mention is the work of one of our past PhD students, Andrew Thompson, together with Yannick Perez. They recently published a very interesting paper on the value of these different V2X services. So I invite you to have a look at that paper in Energy Policy if you're interested in this. And the results are a bit different from the poll we just did. The results actually showed that bill management would be the biggest value, at least in the current conditions. But on the other hand, this paper also evokes the possibility of stacking different value streams instead of proposing just one service. And if I may make a remark on the regulation side, it's also underlined here that the regulatory action is really the key to make the most of these V2G technologies. Yes, I think that's it for me.
Thank you, Amelia, and also interesting to see that our poll differs a bit from what Andrew Thompson and Yannick Perez say in their report, and how we see that different perspectives change as we talk about. Moving on to more to the business models, Mirko, it is something that is very important, and to innovate in business models is very important. And I think fleets provide a very interesting opportunity in this. And maybe we would like to know more what sort of innovation that's happening right now in terms of business models.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Brian. Yes, as I was hinting before, I mean, NLX last year completed finalized the realization of a project for 300 electric buses in Santiago de Chile. And we illustrated this in our paper that just sent the link before on the chat, but anyway, so on our website, nlfoundation.org. Practically, this was a successful experiment because we found out that people were really enthusiastic. I mean, there was a high level of satisfaction and also a better usage experience with respect to the normal buses. So this also encouraged modal shift, and so there was a better integration also with the other platform and other public transportation system. And so apart from that, what is really an important point that also Emilia was mentioning was the possibility, that with these electric buses, there was the opportunities in using the smart charging terminals to reduce the stress to the grid. and also to realize new extra profit, let's say, new income opportunity with V2G. This because this is really, I mean, for me, it can represent the future of prosumers, because people can get with these ancillary services that can be offered, I mean, that are allowed. People can really gain also and realize extra revenues just for I mean consuming and injecting to the grid the electricity when it's not necessary. So this can be replicated in many other situations. This was just a pilot project, but in any case, the impact, of course, apart from reduction of air pollution and fleet renewal and all the rest, we had really good feedback. And apart from that, just let me come back also to a question that was made before. They say, okay, how can we reduce CO2 emission if the electricity is produced by fossil fuels? Of course, this will not be, I mean, the future. The future will be electricity produced by renewable mainly. So if the electricity is produced by RES, as in the case, for instance, of this experiment in Santiago de Chile, CO2 emission will be almost close to zero, of course, in the usage. So this is really something that should be considered in the future. And yeah, regarding the effect and the innovation, as I said, this can really help the grid, can reduce, as I said before, the peak power demand. And at the same time, for instance, in Chile, there is a lot of wind energy that that sometimes during the night is produced mainly, but it's not, I mean, used because there is no demand during the night. So in this way, with this kind of experiments, if we are charging electric vehicles and especially buses that are not running during the night, you can also avoid some curtailment of this energy. So it's also something, a measure, let's say, of not wasting resources. So it's another thing to be considered.
Indeed, and then we finally move from to a question which we already had, and there is quite a lively discussion going on here about the regulations, sort of market design, what sort of aggregation that can happen. So we have questions which here say, how can storage participate in different or battery EVs participate? I'm sorry, in different markets at the same time. So we have the question of aggregation, and then we also have the question of what sort of market design.
Yeah, it's I think all of them are quite interesting, and they are, let's say, focusing in my last word that I have for these 4 minutes. So basically, I mean, so far, so from the research that I've been looking to, basically there is a lot of effort in many proof of concept projects in trying to demonstrate that electric vehicles can efficiently contribute to power system operation, to distribution network operation, so on and so forth. And most of them, as Emilia mentioned, they are successful, and basically they verify that electric vehicles can go into V2X. Now the good question is that, okay, is there any business model for that? So is there enough benefits in the provision of these services for the consumer, like, for instance, demand side management, and for the transmission or distribution system operator? So that's the big question. I mean, is there any business model for provision of these services? Okay, so for that, I will try to try to focus this. So the first thing is that from the TSO perspective, currently we need to have in our minds that the contributors to provide flexibility to the system in most cases all over the world are the big generation facilities. In many countries, it is not open the market for flexibility to demand, and of course, in many others, it's not open to a small virtual power plants or aggregators. If they are open, sometimes what happens is that the minimum size of this virtual power plant is, for instance, 10 megawatts. So that makes really difficult for aggregators to contribute. Okay, so that's one thing. If we think now on the distribution system side, distribution is a really, really regulated business, where apart from, let's say, traditional business plan, it is difficult to find, let's say, good policy practices. I'm not saying that there are like many projects trying to bring this additional thing, but currently regulation is far behind that. It's far behind that because in many countries, in most countries, batteries are not allowed to participate or to be connected to the distribution network, or even who is the one that should manage. So nowadays, in this part, it is really difficult. Of course, what we need is to unlock the opportunity for distribution system operator to manage these services, so they can really decide which is the best option for the planning or for the operation of the network, whether they can invest in reinforcing some corridor, or taking the flexibility for electric vehicles or distributed generation, for instance. But still, these things are, let's say, work in progress in many things. So, and in order to finish and try to focus in the question of aggregation. So, of course, aggregation is needed. Of course, we need a smart aggregation, and we need also low-cost aggregation, because the benefits that currently the aggregation or the participation in these markets we can get are really reduced. Because remember that we are competing with, let's say, big generation facilities or distributed generation facilities where the cost of flexibility is really reduced, it's really low. I mean, they just close and open, and if they are already available because they are online, they know where they are. So the complexity of the aggregation is that we need to be really competitive if we want really to make a business case for that. Okay, so that was more or less it.
Thank you, Pablo. And it's really interesting because eventually it's all about also the business case that the aggregator himself will have, and whether the aggregator would also be the distribution company or the electricity retailer itself, as that could be who would be the aggregator is another question that we need to really answer regulatorily on top of everything. There was one interesting question, and before we get into these questions, I would like to ask Emilia if you want to react to any comments of Mirko and Pablo about.
Yes, sorry. So I quite agree with the comments made by Mirko and Pablo, notably on the aggregation side. So we need to define how this aggregation is done, and who has access to these markets, and also, of course, the business model side is a very crucial point. So there is a kind of the situation is not quite very clear after the business models for V2G currently, and that's one of the blocking points as well.
So Mirko, what did you see in this? Because as I understand, Emilia really says that business models are still the roadblock to unlocking V2X.
Of course,
maybe you could give
for
some insights
business
on
model
that.
to be viable. I mean, you need first of all technology that support that, but also, I mean, costs that should be competitiveness in the cost. And we are getting to there. I mean, this virus, of course, slowed down everything, especially when we are talking about the battery cost or the electric vehicles itself. So probably we will need a little bit more time. But I mean, just before the virus, we were really close to reach full competitiveness. And in this way, the world was really changing very fast. So I really hope that in the future, I mean, we will continue on that pattern and not go back to what was a few years ago. So yeah, I would say that if we continue on the road until a few months ago, a few weeks ago, we will have viable business model very soon. I mean, the business model would be viable very soon, and so the electric vehicles will increase their penetration anyway in the market.
So indeed, of course, businesses have to now think about restructuring their entire thinking process once we get out of this virus, and then we don't know what we would get into. But Pablo, now that we have come to this black swan event question, what do you think? And the EV industry is so nascent and so young still. So how do you think we can proactively, as a
that's a quite tricky question. I mean, I think it's the industry. I mean, it's about technology. So as Emilia mentioned, I mean, all the automakers, they are doing really good in trying to find which are the services that we can offer and that we can participate. But for me, the question is that in order to push regulators to move forward, because regulators, what we will do is to guarantee that the supply of electricity to everybody is in quality and is efficient. So if we are able to demonstrate that with our approaches of D2G, with our technological developments, we are able to improve the efficiency of the system and to reduce the cost of the system, then regulators will move forward. And of course, I mean, as I mentioned before, there are like many barriers to solve before, because remember that in some countries, for instance, demand is not, cannot participate in markets. In many countries, there are not even markets for flexibility. So if we think in a worldwide vision, we need to go step by step, as we are doing so far. Proof of concept projects where we demonstrate the feasibility of these things, then carry out some real practices with control projects, for instance in Belgium, and then let's say move forward. But of course, we always need to guarantee, because DSOs, TSOs, they are really skeptical of moving from the business as usual, okay? Because they always want to rely on security and safety of the system. And introducing an additional element like EVs would be something that they will be really skeptical. So we need to really convince them that this is a really valuable approach.
Yeah, indeed, and I think convincing them would only work when we have regulatory sandboxes, which is the question by itself, that we should set up technology and regulatory sandboxes together in small regions which can be put together, and prove that these regulations work, these technologies work under certain set of controlled situations, and then roll it out. But I think no discussion on EVs, even if it's with the power sector, ends without this two questions which continue to come up again and again. One from the Formula E story, which is about swapping of batteries versus charging. In many cases, a lot of people think that this is a closed question, that we are already moving towards plug-in vehicles, but there is still always this question about where can swapping of batteries be considered. And there is a second question which always comes up, which is EVs versus hydrogen.
Well, okay, I'm not an engineer, so I don't know what are the peculiarities between battery, if there can be some constraints on battery swapping or battery charging. But I would say that both solutions seem to work well. So of course, if you do battery swapping, you need to charge this battery because you will not throw away. They are not one-time use. So more or less, I don't see so much difference. I mean, it's just a matter of charging faster the vehicles. So I think let's see if the charging will decrease, the time for charging will decrease as it was doing. Every month was decreasing, I mean, the time of charging in the last year at least. So if we will reach, I mean, an acceptable time for charging a vehicle, then we don't need any more battery swapping. But for the moment, yes, I can understand that there can still be some need.
Indeed, Pablo, do you think these hydrogen will, that's another beautiful case of sector coupling between the gas sector and the electricity?
So I believe that in the, I don't know, from 2040 or 2050, we will be hydrogen based. Currently, I think for the next decade, we will focus on basically battery-based electric vehicles. But one of the limitations hydrogen has so far is that if you consider all the life cycle cost of producing hydrogen, etc., it is on the production side, on the transportation side of the hydrogen. And these are things that, you know, it happens like this because there are, like, let's say, low research on that. But as we do more research on that, I think hydrogen could be a really good option for future. And regarding the other question, which is the battery swapping, I just want to raise the point that the way nowadays, at least in the countries that I know, people are facing mobility is a bit different. So in the old times, people want to have their own private car. Nowadays, young people, they don't care about having their own car. They want to move. So they use a lot of car sharing options, the carpooling options, or rental of cars. So under these circumstances, which is, let's say, more and more increasing, battery swapping is something that works. But of course, I think private cars will never work for that. If you have a Porsche, I mean, you will never change it for a Renault Zoe. I mean, that's life.
Yeah, indeed, and I think battery swapping also in some cases of emerging economies might work for fleets of taxis or three-wheeler tuk-tuks and things like that.
So I have
Emilia,
to say that Velicom
I
doesn't
give
work
you
on
the
the
last
battery
few
side
minutes.
or battery swapping, so I don't have really an expert view on that. But I've seen that there are projects on this in China that are ongoing, so it would seem to be a possibility as well. However, we do see that there are also other alternatives to fast charging than just battery swapping. We notably have this one project on where we try to develop an innovative fast charging service from vehicle to vehicle charging. So using a fleet, you could do local fast charging without going to the grid, and so without any grid investment. And I also already spoke of the external range extender type of thing. For instance, the one that's developed by the startup EP Tender. So that would be another alternative as well. It's kind of like battery swapping, but well, in a more of an external way. So on the hydrogen side, I'm also not an expert on hydrogen, but at least according to the industrial partners of Velicom, so French car makers, the hydrogen would seem to be a much longer way in the development chain, so it's not a solution that's going to be available immediately like electric cars are. And of course for the climate priorities we need to take action now. We can't wait till 2030, 2050. So I think electric cars are a good solution in that way. But of course this is something where we need to explore all the avenues. So electrification, hydrogen, shared mobility of course, and also other more behavioral or organizational solutions.
Indeed, and yes, we have to also look at, which was also pointed out in the discussion board, that we have to look at the entire value chain of eventually using renewable energies for powering the EVs and the battery sector. But with this, I would first like to thank my panelists. Thank you so much for being here and giving us this insight. Thanks to our listeners and our participants. Thanks to our online team, which is all over the world in different time zones. helping us out with this platform. I think we can conclude by saying that at least in the near future, mobility is going to be more and more electric, is going to also be more and more connected with the power sector. Power sector has challenges coming up in terms of how it's going to handle this EV as a load, as well as opportunity from vehicle to X and all these new services that EV can provide. So, and also maybe we will have more and more shared mobility in the future.